Saint Martin de Porres, the saint of the impossible. To speak of Saint Martin de Porres is not just to speak of miracles. It is to speak of a mystery, of how God decided to manifest his power not through kings, bishops, or wise men, but through a poor, rejected, and silent man. Today, his name is venerated throughout the world. But in life, he was despised for his skin color, relegated to the lowest place, and condemned to an invisible existence. And yet, he was one of the most extraordinary men who have ever walked this earth. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine Lima, Peru in the 16th century. Dirt streets, adobe houses, a society divided by races, castes, and privileges. In that profoundly unjust world, Martin de Porres was born, the illegitimate son of an Afro-descendant woman and a Spanish nobleman who never recognized him. From childhood, he learned a brutal lesson. The world may reject you, but God never does. Martin was not a priest. He did not preach from pulpits. He did not write books. He swept floors. He washed dishes. He healed wounds. He fed the poor. And from that absolute humility, God worked miracles that shook an entire nation. What you are about to hear are not popular legends. They are documented facts, testified under oath, investigated during his canonization process. This is the story of the 7 most impactful miracles of Saint Martin de Porres. First miracle, the gift of being in 2 places at the same time. Year 1630. Lima still slept under the thick silence of the colonial night. In a convent of Santo Domingo, oil lamps dimly illuminated the stone corridors. As every night, the prior of the convent, Friar Fernando Aragones, made his usual rounds. He was not a man given to fantasies or exaggerations. He was known for his discipline, his rigor, and his absolute fidelity to the truth. One by one, he checked that the brothers were in their cells. A simple routine, repeated for years. When he arrived at the cell of Martin de Porres, he found nothing out of the ordinary. Martin was there, kneeling, immobile, immersed in a prayer so deep that he seemed disconnected from the world. Friar Fernando paused just a few seconds longer than usual, not out of suspicion, but out of respect. He noted his presence and continued his round. Nothing foreshadowed that, at that very moment, something extraordinary was happening at several kilometers from the convent. In a well-to-do house in Lima, Captain Gonzalo de la Masa was fighting for his life. Fevers were consuming him. His breathing was irregular. He deliriously raved without rest. The best doctors had been called. They had tried everything they knew. And finally, with grave faces, they pronounced the most dreaded sentence: "There is nothing more to do." The captain's wife, desperate, had sent a messenger to the convent, asking for spiritual help. But before that messenger even reached his destination, something happened. In the silence of the room, Martin de Porres appeared. No footsteps were heard. No door was opened. There was no announcement. He was simply there, dressed in his humble habit, with the same serene face as always. He approached the sick man's bed. The captain, in his delirium, opened his eyes. Martin spoke in a soft, firm voice full of peace. "Do not fear. God is not finished with you yet." He slowly placed his hands on the captain's burning forehead. He did not utter long prayers. He did not make extraordinary gestures. And then, immediately, the fever disappeared. The captain's body stopped trembling. His breathing normalized. Lucidity returned to his eyes. He was healthy. Martin smiled slightly, and just as he had appeared, he disappeared. The next morning, completely recovered, Captain Gonzalo de la Masa went to the convent. He needed to personally thank the man who had saved his life. When he related what had happened, the prior, Friar Fernando, was visibly disturbed. "That is impossible," he said with complete certainty. "I saw Brother Martin in his cell all night. He did not leave. He did not move," the captain insisted. He described with precision every word, every gesture, every detail of the encounter. Friar Fernando summoned Martin. When he was asked how he could have been in both places, Martin lowered his head, visibly uncomfortable. He never liked these conversations. After a long silence, he replied with humility, "Father, I only went where the Lord showed me there was a need. During the canonization process, this was not considered an isolated event. Dozens of witnesses testified under oath to having seen Martin in different places at the same time. Simultaneous appearances were even documented outside of Peru, while others claimed to have seen him in Lima at the same time. Ecclesiastical and medical investigators analyzed each testimony with extreme rigor. The conclusion was unanimous. No natural explanation was possible. What for human reason was impossible, for God, was nothing more than another act of mercy. Second miracle, the body that could not contain God. Year 1635. Lima rested under the thick cloak of night. The streets were silent, the houses dark. Only the convent of Santo Domingo remained awake, like a heart that never stops beating. Within its walls, the air smelled of melted wax, ancient stone, prayer accumulated over decades. That night, Fray Juan de Barberena could not sleep. It was no ordinary insomnia. It was a deep unease, difficult to explain, as if something were calling him. He tried to close his eyes, to pray in silence, but his heart found no rest. Finally he got up. He carefully put on his habit and left his cell. He did not light any lamps. He knew every corner of the convent by heart. He advanced through the corridors with slow, almost fearful steps, taking care that the rustle of his sandals did not break the sacred silence of the dawn. Upon reaching the chapel, he paused for a moment. The place was dark, barely illuminated by a few candles that still burned in front of the altar. He pushed the door gently, and at that instant, the world seemed to stop. There was Martin de Porres, but he was not kneeling as was customary. He was not prostrate. He was not standing. He was suspended in the air. His body floated, motionless, more than a meter above the ground. There was no movement at all, no trembling, no visible effort. His arms extended in the shape of a cross, his hands open, his face serene, completely transfigured, his eyes closed, as if his gaze were fixed on a reality that did not belong to this world. There were no ropes, there were no supports, there was no hidden mechanism, there was not the slightest possibility of deception. A soft light enveloped his figure. It did not come from the candles, it did not cast common shadows. It was a different light, warm, reassuring. Friar Juan felt his legs trembling. He did not dare to advance. He did not dare to speak. He hardly dared to breathe. He remained there, motionless, as an involuntary witness to a mystery that surpassed all human understanding. Time ceased to have meaning. He did not know if minutes or hours had passed. He only knew that he was contemplating something he would never forget. Finally, without any noise, Martin's body began to descend, very slowly, like a leaf falling without haste. His feet touched the ground with an impossible softness. There was no thump. There was no sound. Martin opened his eyes, and then he saw him. Friar Juan was still standing, paralyzed by the door. Martin's face changed immediately. The deep peace gave way to an expression of surprise, and then, of deep shame. He lowered his head. He took a few steps towards him, and in a low, almost pleading voice he said, "Father, I beg you not to say anything about this to anyone." He did not speak as one who has performed a feat. He spoke as one who has been discovered in the secret intimacy. But the testimony could not remain hidden. When Friar Juan informed his superiors, investigations began. And then something even more surprising came to light. It was not the first time. Other brothers testified to having seen Martin rise during night prayer. Some saw him levitate while serving as an acolyte at Mass. Others claimed to have seen him suspended in his cell, completely absorbed in prayer. One testimony in particular stated that, on one occasion, Martin rose so high that his head touched the ceiling of the chapel, almost 4 meters high. It always happened in the same way, in silence, in solitude, during moments of intense union with God, never in front of crowds, never as a spectacle, never to impress. When superiors asked him about these phenomena, Martin did not try to explain them, nor justify them, nor take advantage of them. He only lowered his head and said simply, "The love of God is so great that sometimes the body cannot contain it." During the canonization process, doctors and specialists were called in to evaluate these facts. One of them, known for his skepticism, left a written record in his official report. I have examined the circumstances with extreme rigor. There is no possible physiological or physical explanation. There is no fraud, no hallucination, no perceptual error. This phenomenon defies the known laws of gravity. For science, it was incomprehensible. For Martin, it was not a miracle. It was simply a consequence of love. Third miracle, the multiplication of food. Lima was going through one of the darkest periods in its history. Droughts had ruined harvests. Diseases were weakening the population. Inequality was brutal. In the streets, one could see barefoot children, abandoned old people, freed slaves without a home, women searching for food scraps in the garbage, hunger, misery, abandonment. And in the midst of that scenario, the convent of Santo Domingo had become an unexpected refuge, not because it had great riches, not because food was plentiful, but because Martin de Porres was there. Every afternoon, without fail at the same time, an endless line began to form in front of the convent doors. They came from different neighborhoods. Some walked kilometers. They did not come for bread alone. They came because they knew something with absolute certainty. Martin never rejected anyone. For him, there were no differences. Skin color, social status, or past did not matter. If someone was hungry, for Martin that was reason enough. But that day, the situation was critical. In the pantry, there was barely a small basket with bread. Friar Cristobal, in charge of the food, checked the shelves again and again. There was nothing more. He approached Martin with a worried face. "Brother Martin," he said in a low voice, "we barely have bread for 30 people, and there are more than 200 waiting outside." Friar Cristobal expected an order, perhaps to distribute less, perhaps to close the door, perhaps to tell him to come back another day. Martin looked at the basket. Then he looked up at the crowd waiting in silence. Men, women, children, with their eyes full of hope. And then he spoke, with the same serenity as always. "God will provide." It was not a dramatic phrase. It was not a scream. It was a calm affirmation, born of absolute faith. Martin took the first bread and began to distribute it. One by one, the poor advanced. They held out their hands. They received bread. 30 people ate. The basket remained the same. 50. The basket remained full. 100 people, and there was still bread. Friar Cristobal watched with wide eyes of astonishment. He did not understand what he was seeing. 200 people ate until they were full, and when the line ended, the basket still had bread. Martin took the remaining bread, took it to the backyard. There, stray dogs, skinny cats, animals that no one fed, were waiting. "In the house of the Lord," he said softly, "nothing is wasted." And he fed them too. This was not an isolated event. It was not an exception. For 30 years, almost every day, the same thing happened. Between 160 and 200 people were fed daily in the convent. The provisions were always insufficient according to any human calculation. The superiors, worried, ordered that the records be reviewed. A Spanish accountant was called in to conduct a complete audit. He reviewed entries, exits, inventories. His conclusion was written: "The figures do not match. What is distributed far exceeds what is received. Either the records are completely falsified, or we are witnessing a continuous miracle." The records were examined again. Authentic signatures, consistent data, correct dates. There was no fraud. The prior of the convent declared under oath during the canonization process, "I have supervised the pantry for years. The numbers do not add up. Mathematically, it is impossible. The only explanation is that God multiplied the food in the hands of Brother Martin." For Martin, however, there was no miracle. When he was told about these events, he replied with humility, "I only distribute. The one who feeds is God." And so, day after day, in silence, without seeking recognition, a poor man sustained hundreds of poor people with a faith so great that it turned scarcity into abundance. Fourth miracle, healings that science could not explain. In the 17th century, becoming seriously ill in Lima was often a death sentence. Medicine advanced slowly. Antibiotics did not exist. Infections spread easily. High fever was synonymous with imminent end. Not even power could buy health. Not even the most important man in the viceroyalty. The Viceroy of Peru, Don Luis Jerónimo de Cabrera, better known as the Count of Chincan, was dying in his official residence. 4 days, the best doctors in the colony had examined him. They had tried infusions, bloodletting, poultices. Nothing worked. The fever did not subside. The body wasted away. Consciousness was lost among deliriums. Finally, the doctors met in private and gave their verdict. There was nothing more to do. News spread quickly through Lima. If the viceroy died, the viceroyalty would enter a crisis. Someone then suggested a last resort, not medical, not scientific. Call Brother Martin, it said. If anyone can do something, it is him. Martin de Porres arrived in silence, without titles, without official recognition. He wore the same worn habit as always. He did not ask for explanations. He did not ask questions. He approached the sick man's bed and knelt down. He did not pronounce words aloud. He did not perform theatrical gestures. He simply closed his eyes and prayed. Those present remained silent. It was then that several witnesses declared that they had seen something impossible to describe. A soft light, different from that of the candles, began to surround the viceroy's head. It did not illuminate the room. It did not cast shadows. It seemed to focus solely on him. The doctors watched attentively. One of them took a step back, visibly upset. The Count's breathing changed. It became deeper, more regular. The fever, which until that moment was unbearable to the touch, began to descend. Martin continued praying, motionless. Suddenly the Count opened his eyes. He was not delirious. He was not screaming. He looked clearly. He asked for water. Then he asked to sit down. The doctors rushed over. They touched his forehead. It was cold. Hours before, his death was a matter of time. Now, he was conscious and calm. In the following days, the recovery was complete. There were no relapses. There were no after-effects. The Count of Chincan lived 15 more years, governing the viceroyalty with full lucidity. During the subsequent investigation, the doctors were questioned under oath. Their response was unanimous. There is no medical explanation. The condition was irreversible. The recovery was instantaneous and impossible, according to our knowledge. The viceroy himself left a written record of what happened, attributing his life to the intercession of Brother Martin. This was not an isolated case. Dozens of testimonies relate sudden healings, open ulcers that closed in minutes, deadly fevers that disappeared, infected wounds that healed without a trace. Martin never took credit. When they spoke to him about healings, he always responded the same. I do not heal anyone. I just pray, and God does what he wants. For the science of his time and for subsequent research, only one conclusion was possible. Those healings could not be explained by human means. Fifth miracle. Passing through closed doors. In the convent of Santo Domingo, strict rules existed. The cells were locked at nightfall. The doors were secured with thick iron keys. The corridors fell into absolute silence. Nothing was to break the order. And yet, time and again, something occurred that defied all logic. Martin de Porres appeared inside completely locked rooms. Not once, not twice, repeatedly. Cells with the door secured from the inside, rooms without windows, infirmary rooms sealed off to prevent contagion. The brothers would find Martin already there, praying, attending to a sick person, or simply standing in silence, without noise, without footsteps, without warning. At first, no one dared to say anything. They thought there must be some simple explanation, a mistake, an oversight, but the events were repeated too frequently. One brother declared during the investigation, I myself locked the door with a key. I kept the key with me, and upon returning, Martin was inside. The bewilderment grew. The superiors of the convent ordered a complete inspection of the building. An architect, an expert in colonial constructions, was called in. He inspected walls, floors, ceilings, cells. He looked for tunnels, hidden passages, false doors. His report was clear and forceful. There are no secret accesses. The walls are solid. There is no human way to enter or leave without opening the doors. Even so, the testimonies continued. On one occasion, a seriously ill brother was isolated in a locked room to prevent contagion. No one was to enter. However, at dawn, they found him better, much better, and Martin was sitting next to his bed, praying. "How did you get in?" they asked. Martin did not respond immediately. He lowered his gaze. Finally, he said simply, "When God wants me to be there, he takes me." The prior of the convent, a prudent and rigorous man, was questioned under oath during the canonization process. His testimony was recorded. "I have been a direct witness. I have seen Brother Martin inside locked rooms without any explanation. The walls were no obstacle for him. For Martin, these events were not a source of pride. On the contrary, when he noticed unease among the brothers, he apologized. He asked that they not talk about the subject. He asked for obedience and silence. He never used this gift for his benefit, never to escape an obligation, never to avoid a correction. It always happened when someone needed help, a sick person, a dying person, a soul in danger. During the Stavros court, the theologians reached a clear conclusion. It was not an illusion. It was not a perceptual error. It was not fraud. It was an extraordinary phenomenon, documented by multiple reliable witnesses, with no natural explanation. Martin never spoke of passing through walls. He never spoke of miracles. For him, everything was simple. "I do not go anywhere," he said. "If God needs me there, he puts me there." And so, doors, walls, and locks ceased to be limits when charity called. Sixth miracle. Knowing what no one had said, there was something about Martin de Porres that disturbed, and at the same time, gave peace. Those who approached him knew it. It was not his voice. It was not his gaze. It was the profound feeling that nothing could be hidden from him. People arrived with rehearsed words, incomplete confessions, carefully constructed stories. But before they uttered a single phrase, Martin already knew. He did not guess it. He did not deduce it. He did not ask questions. Simply, he knew it. Men marked by guilt approached with serious faces, ready to tell a softened version of their acts. Martin looked at them with compassion and said gently, "Son, that is not what weighs on your heart." Then he named what no one else knew, the hidden sin, the silent betrayal, the decision made in secret, and the silence became absolute. Women arrived seeking advice, trying to hide deep shames. Before they spoke, Martin told them, "Do not be afraid. God already knows what you carry inside." And he described with precision what they had never confessed. Some burst into tears. Others fell to their knees, not out of fear, but out of relief. Because Martin never used this gift to humiliate, never to expose, never to dominate. He always used it to heal. When he detected a sin, he did not condemn. He offered mercy. When he discovered a dark intention, he did not accuse. He warned with love. When he perceived a betrayal on the way, he did not denounce it publicly. He called for conversion. During the canonization process, dozens of witnesses testified under oath to having lived these experiences. A merchant declared, "I went to ask for advice about a business deal. Before I spoke, he told me exactly the fraud I was planning to commit. No one else knew it. I abandoned a plan that same day." A soldier testified, "I approached pretending piety. Martin spoke to me of the resentment I carried inside, of the crime I had committed in secret. I felt that God himself had seen me. Even priests declared that they had been disconcerted. One of them stated, 'Brother Martin spoke to me of faults that I never confessed to anyone.' There was no judgment, only a sincere invitation to repentance." Ecclesiastical investigators carefully analyzed these testimonies. They looked for human explanations, rumors, previous confessions, coincidences. They found none. The people did not know each other. The facts described were not public. The details were too precise. The final report used a specific term, supernatural knowledge of the human heart. For Martin, however, there was no mystery. When someone asked him how he knew so many things, he responded with humility, "I do not see sins, I see wounded souls, and God shows me what they need to heal." Thus, in silence, without raising his voice, without writing books, without seeking authority, Martin became a mirror of the soul, not to judge it, but to return it to the light. Seventh miracle. The animals obeyed him. In the Santo Domingo convent, there was a constant problem. Mice. They invaded pantries. They gnawed at sacks of grain. They snuck into cells during the night. The friars were desperate. The traps did not work. The poison only made the situation worse. Finally, they asked Martin de Porres for help. Martin did not bring traps. He did not ask for cats. He did not suggest extermination. He went to the backyard of the convent and spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not make strange gestures. He simply spoke, like someone talking to a friend. "Brother Mice," he said, "if you stay here, we will lack food. I beg you to go to the garden, where no one will harm you." The friars watched from afar, incredulous. Then something impossible to ignore happened. The mice began to come out, one after another, in an orderly line. They crossed the courtyard. They went through the orchard and disappeared into the vegetation. They never returned, but it was not the only episode. Stray dogs came to the convent and remained calm, without fighting, without barking. Cats slept next to them without showing aggression. Birds perched near Martin while he prayed, as if the silence attracted them. The animals seemed to recognize something that humans sometimes forget. On more than one occasion, Martin was seen praying for sick animals. Open wounds healed. Fractured legs regained strength. He never sought attention for it. He never allowed too much talk. Friar left written testimony. "I have seen fierce animals become tame before him. It was like contemplating paradise restored, where there is no fear or violence." For Martin, there were no hierarchies in creation. There were no insignificant lives. When he was reprimanded for feeding animals with food from the convent, he replied, "How can I deny bread to one who is also a creature of God?" During the canonical investigation, the witnesses agreed on something essential. The animals were not forced. They were not trained. They were not controlled. They obeyed freely. The theologians interpreted it as a sign of original harmony, that which, according to faith, existed before sin. Martin explained it simply: all creatures recognize the language of love. And so, in a world marked by violence, inequality, and contempt for the weakest, a humble man remembered that holiness does not dominate, but reconciles. Final message. Martin de Porres was rejected from birth, marked by his skin color, limited by a world that measured the value of people according to their origin and not according to their heart. He was never a priest. He never held important positions. He never had human authority or a voice in the halls of power. His life was spent between brooms, dishes to wash, wounds to heal, and floors that no one wanted to clean. But while the world saw him as small, God saw him as great. Because God does not look at titles, does not measure prestige, is not impressed with ranks. God looks at the heart. And in Martin's humble heart he found absolute obedience, unconditional love, and a faith that did not ask for explanations. From that silent heart God worked the impossible. Saint Martin died in Lima on the 30th of Refers Fortfarthus what is inst fine, because his intercession was not buried. It remained alive. It is still alive. Today, centuries later, his name continues to be pronounced in hospitals, in homes without bread, in prisons, in forgotten streets, on the lips of those who have no one else to turn to. Saint Martin de Porres remains as an eternal testimony that God does not choose the perfect, but perfects the humble, that true power is not born of force, but of the love that is given, and that the impossible is only impossible for man, but never for God. Martin de Porres was rejected from birth, marked by his skin color, limited by a world that measured the value of people according to their origin and not according to their heart. He was never a priest. He never held important positions. He never had human authority or a voice in the halls of power. His life was spent among brooms, dishes to wash, wounds to heal, and floors that no one wanted to clean. But while the world saw him as small, God saw him as great. Because God does not look at titles, does not measure prestige, is not impressed with ranks. God looks at the heart. And in Martin's humble heart, he found absolute obedience, unconditional love, and a faith that did not ask for explanations. From that silent heart, God worked the impossible. Saint Martin died in Lima on the 1st of 1639. But his death was not an end. It was ascending, because his intercession was not buried. It remained alive. It remains alive. Today, centuries later, his name continues to be spoken in hospitals, in homes without bread, in prisons, in forgotten streets, on the lips of those who no longer have anyone to turn to. Saint Martin de Porres remains as an eternal testimony that God does not choose the perfect, but perfects the humble. That true power is not born of strength, but of the love that is given, and that the impossible is only impossible for man, but never for God.